Vulnerability risk. So welcome back to another video. Now we are discussing about the vulnerability risk. When isolation mechanism isolation mechanisms fail due to unpatched bugs or coding errors. In the virtualization layer. In the virtualization layer. Or critical vulnerabilities. Critical vulnerabilities arise. Vulnerabilities risk. When isolation mechanism fail due to unpatched bug or coding errors in the virtualization layer, critical vulnerability arises. Critical vulnerability arises. Vulnerability risk. When isolation mechanism vulnerability risk. When isolation mechanism fail due to unpatched bugs. When isolation mechanism fail due to unpatched bugs or coding errors in the virtualization layer, critical vulnerabilities arises. Critical vulnerability arises. Vulnerabilities risk. When vulnerability risk, when isolation mechanism fail due to unpatched bugs or coding errors in the virtualization layer, uh, critical vulnerabilities arises. Vu- vulnerable vulnerability risk, when isolation layer fails when isolation vulnerability risk, when isolation mechanism fails due to unpatched unpatched bugs or coding errors in the virtualization layer. Critical vulnerability arises. hypervisor or VM escape. Hypervisor VM escape and attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM to compromise the underlying host system or take control of neighbor neighboring tenant VM. Hypervisor or VM escape. Hypervisor and VM escape, an attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM to compromise the underlying host system or take control of neighboring tenant VM. An attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM. An attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM. Hypervisor VM escape. VM escape. Hypervisor VM escape. An attacker breaks out of the restricted guest VM. Breaks out of the restricted guest VM. Hypervisor or VM escape. Hypervisor or VM escape. Hypervisor or VM escape. Hypervisor or VM escape. An attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM to compromise the underlying host system or take control of neighboring tenant VM or neighboring tenant VMs. Hypervisor hy- hypervisor or VM escape. An attacker an attacker breaks out of their or must break out of their restricted guest VM to compromise the underlying host system or their take control of neighboring tenant VMs. Hyper, hypervisor or VM escape. An attacker an attacker breaks an attacker an attacker breaks out of their restricted guest VM 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 hyper hypervisor VM escape. An attacker breaks out of their breaks out of their breaks out of their uh, breaks out of the restricted justification to compromise to com to compromise underlying to compromise to compromise underlying host system or take control of neighboring guest VM, neighboring tenant VM, take control of neighboring tenant VMs. Shared resource, shared resource exploitation, shared resource exploitation. Malicious tenant consumes excessive shared hardware resources, causing a denied service, causing a denied service, denial of service loss for others on the same host. Shared resource exploitation, shared resource exploitation, shared resource exploitation, shared resource exploitation, shared resource, shared resource exploitation, shared resource exploitation, a malicious tenant consumes excessive shared hardware resources. Malicious tenant consumes excessive shared hardware resources, causing a denial of service for others on the same host, causing a denial of service for others on the same host, causing a denial of service for others on the same host, causing a denial of service for others on the same host. Shared resource exploitation. Shared resource exploitation. A malicious tenant consumes excessive shared hardware resources. Shared resource exploitation. A malicious tenant consumes excessive shared hardware resources. Shared hardware resources, causing a denial of service for others on the same host. Separation of staff. Separation of staff. Separation of staff. or department network isolation is a foundational security requirement in shared office Wi-Fi environment. Safety security requirement is shared office Wi-Fi environments where different teams share the same physical routers. It ensures that each department's digital workspace operates completely independently. Core principle of user isolation. According to company IT policies, effective isolation enforces three strict rules. Data protection: one department staff must never be able to view, access or modify another department's files. Non-interference: one team's network vendor settings must not interfere with the operations of software tools running on another team's laptops. Performance security: heavy file malicious or heavy file downloading activities from marketing team must not degrade the internet speed or compromise the security of neighboring finance teams. How it enforced: network engineers utilize virtual networks such as VLANs and smart routers tech to partition a single physical office network into multiple isolated digital zones. The main router acts as a strict gatekeeper, managing and isolating the allocation of shared physical resources like the internet speed, network ports, firewalls, and server access. Vulnerability risk: when isolation mechanisms fail due to unpatched bugs or setup errors in the router settings, critical vulnerabilities arise. Router or VLAN escape: an attacker breaks out of the restricted guest network to compromise the underlying central server system or take control of neighboring staff laptops. Shared resource exploitation: a malicious user consumes excessive shared internet bandwidth limits, causing a denial of service for all other workers on the same floor.